Okay, so you saw the defendant in this case, Tremaine Wilbourn, saying he did not receive a fair trial. He shot and killed Officer Sean Bolton in Memphis back on August 1st, 2015. Yosha, let me ask this. I mean, the evidence was so overwhelming in this case. He turned himself in. He said he did it. He had this defense of self-defense. You had the person calling 911. You had the witnesses that saw the shooting. Why is he saying he didn't receive a fair trial?
So I believe he's talking here about the mitigation portion. So he has been found guilty here. This is a sentencing portion. And the judge said, I'm not going to allow you to have an expert witness to testify about a specific type of race-related trauma, because the judge said this is not commonly accepted scientific fact.
Right.
And so there's rules about what you can have and what can be heard in a courtroom. And the judge said no. And then that's why you see this outburst in this case.
Right. And you brought that up. The race factor here. There was an expert witness, a doctor that talked about statistics and PTSD in the black community as it relates to police shootings. But to your point, yes, the evidence outweighs all of the statistics of what he may believe to be true in the black community. It was the evidence that suggested that Tremaine did indeed shoot Officer Sean Bolton.
Yes, but in this case, we're beyond the evidence phase. So you can have mitigating factors. You can have his family come in. You can talk about childhood trauma. But again, the judge is the arbitrator of the law. The judge says what can and cannot come in. And here the judge made that decision. And then he got very upset. The defendant got very upset about that and said, I don't want to have any mitigating factors or circumstances at all. And that would have been terrible, because if he wasn't allowed to present, or if he chose not to present any mitigating factors, the death penalty would be much more certain in this case.
Right, absolutely. We are actually going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to revisit the Paul Cortez case from 2005, which happened in New York City. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss it. I have a very special in-studio guest. We'll be right back. In Memphis, after 2 hours of deliberation, the jury has reached a verdict in the Tremaine Wilbourn case. Again, this is a death penalty case for the 2015 murder of Officer Sean Bolton in Memphis. We're waiting for that courtroom to fill back up to wait for those jurors to come back in. But while we do, Yosha, let me ask this. What do you think the verdict will be? It's three possibilities: life with parole, life without parole, or, of course, the death penalty.
I think, given the gruesome nature of this case, the fact that the officer was shot in the face, I think that the jury is going to go with the death penalty here. They only took 2 hours,
right.
So that could mean a variety of things. I mean, 2 hours could mean that the death penalty was definitely off the table. They weren't going to sentence someone to death, or it could mean that this case was that closed and shut, that dry, that they were able to go with the death penalty. So it could really go on either side, because you're thinking, really, could someone sentence someone to death after only 2 hours? But again, given the gruesome nature of this crime, I could definitely see it.
Well, not only did he shoot Officer Bolton in the face, he shot him 7 additional times after he had fallen to the ground, too. So I think you're right. Maybe there is something. You can see Officer Bolton there on your screen. Again, he was killed back in 2015 by this defendant, Tremaine Wilbourn. And, you know, I think, too, there's another aspect to this, that the defense initially, during opening statements, tried to paint the picture that Tremaine thought he was a victim because he was approached by this white officer and he was in fear for his life. I mean, at the end of the day, there were drugs in the car. He admitted he had gotten in the car to go with someone to sell drugs. He was a convicted felon in possession of a weapon. So I'm sure many of the jury is saying, we don't even buy that whole defense of you were scared because it was a white officer and you were black. What we do believe is you were committing a crime. You were a felon in possession of a weapon, which would have gotten you at least 10 years in prison just for that charge, not to include the drug charges.
So what's really important here is we're balancing those aggravating factors with those mitigating factors. And so the jury has to consider, is his traumatic life, is the fact that he was abandoned by his mother, are those enough to outweigh what the state is putting forward? So as you said, one of the factors is that he was a convicted felon. Another factor is that he was a police officer on duty. And then the third factor is that he was killed, the officer was killed because the defendant was trying to avoid arrest. So we're really kind of balancing those factors, because Wilbourn obviously has been found guilty, and so it's really up to the jury to say, are these mitigating factors, is his sad life enough to overcome all of those things that the prosecution is putting forth?
So there's another offense too, the carjacking, right, which essentially is an armed robbery. So there's many years that he could face in prison for that as well. So do you think that will add to the fact that this jury decides life in prison or death?
Certainly. I think this whole chain of events is going to really color the juror's mind negatively, because not only was he found guilty of shooting someone in the face, shooting a police officer, shooting him then again repeatedly, he then goes and carjacks another individual. So that's it's just not looking good for him. Again, this is why my prediction, and you never know with jurors, you can never read, is death penalty.
And he told that victim of the carjacking, I just shot a police officer. So you had the defendant admitting to his crime to another victim. We're watching the courtroom there, waiting for that jury to get back in. But what do you think of Wilbourn's behavior during this entire trial? It just doesn't look good for him. Here you are fighting for your life, whether it's life in prison without parole or the death penalty, but yet and still he's being disrespectful to the court. He's got these outbursts going on. That doesn't look favorable to him.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't. And as a defense attorney, that's one of the first things that we tell our clients. Behave, especially in front of a jury, especially because they're judging your every move. And so this was really, it's not good. It's definitely going to inevitably color the minds of the jurors negatively, because they're going to be saying, look, he can't even sit still. He's going to have these outbursts. They're aggressive, they're mean. And again, he's not helping himself. So again, I think that factors towards the fact that the jury might really be going with the death penalty here.
Absolutely. And speaking of outbursts, let's take a look at an outburst earlier this morning in the courtroom. Wow. We just saw Tremaine Wilbourn tell the judge he's not staying for the rest of the trial. Now, keep in mind, this is a death penalty case. The jury has reached that decision. We're waiting for them to come back into the courtroom. But Yosha, if I was fighting for my life, I would not tell a judge, I don't want to come back in this courtroom. Because if I'm on that jury, I'm going to say, well, this guy doesn't even care about the outcome of this trial. Why would he even care about the outcome of our decision?
It doesn't look good. The optics of it are very negative. He should have stayed. He should have. It's obviously a stressful situation for Mr. Wilbourn, but he needs to remain calm. And this is a situation where if I'm the defense attorney, I'm like wanting to slap my hand over his mouth, because it's really only going to impact him negatively. He's in the heat of the moment, but that heat of the moment is going to impact him for the rest of his life. And so it was absolutely the right thing for the defense here to ask for a mistrial. They need to preserve that issue for the inevitable appeal that is going to come next.
But it wasn't just today that he was doing these outbursts. I mean, he was disrespectful the entire trial. Even over the weekend, there were issues with him. So as a defense attorney, wouldn't you just like call him into a room and say, hey, man, listen, this is not looking good for you. We need you to control yourself. Wouldn't you do that as a defense attorney?
And I can almost guarantee that his defense attorneys were doing that. I'm sure they had repeated conversations. But the issue is, at the end of the day, Mr. Wilbourn is a grown man, and he has to make his own choices. So his defense attorneys can say, this is going to look really bad for you, but if he's the one who's in control of his actions. So he really didn't help himself here, and it's not looking good for him.
Yeah, he is responsible for his actions, and he did ask for a mistrial, at least the defense did. Let's take a listen to what the judge had to say in that. Okay, that was Lori Hall, a mitigation specialist. She was talking about Tremaine Wilbourn's childhood and his adulthood. You saw their poor decision making. They talked about the bank robbery that occurred several years ago that he went to prison for. We're still waiting for that jury to fix the jury sheet. They had to add an aggregating factor to that before the judge will allow them to render that verdict there in the courtroom. Yosha, let me switch gears and talk about, we heard this mitigation specialist, Ms. Hall, talk about Tremaine's background, his childhood, and some of the things he did as an adult. Me being a former police officer, do you think if Tremaine would have had tougher sentences? I mean, bank robbery could carry up to 25 years. He served about 8 of those 25. Do you think if maybe there were tougher sentencing, even for that, that this whole thing could have been prevented? I think so, but what say you?
I disagree. I think if Tremaine had not been abused or neglected as a child, I think if he had been given the proper services to become an adult that many of us are privileged to have, I think instead of rerouting all the money that we use for prisons and incarceration, if he had been given that care and love early on, I think that we would have seen a completely different outcome. I don't think that jail necessarily reforms. I think the current statistics and many studies show that that doesn't help. I think had he been getting that help early on, that his life could have been completely different, and it's very unfortunate that he didn't get that.
But what about all the kids that grow up in the exact same situation but don't end up like Tremaine Wilbourn? What do you say to that?
I mean, everyone responds to trauma in different ways, but I think had we been giving him the support and services that this person, who obviously couldn't cope with the very traumatic circumstances of being abandoned by his parents, I think things could have been a lot different for him.
Got it. So again, Tremaine Wilbourn was convicted over the weekend in the murder of Sean Bolton. Let's take a look at that verdict coming in. Okay, so there you have it. It was unanimous. The jury there in Memphis, Tennessee, sentenced Tremaine Wilbourn to life without the possibility of parole in the 2015 shooting death of Officer Sean Bolton. Still with me, Yosha. Yosha, I want to point out a few things here. The jury said beyond reasonable doubt, a person previously convicted of violent felonies. He did the shooting in order to prevent the lawful arrest and against a law enforcement officer or first responder who he should have known was a law enforcement officer. Of course, Sean Bolton was in uniform. So life without parole. Have you ever seen, we noticed Tremaine was not in the courtroom. Have you ever seen a defendant not be in the courtroom for a life or death situation?
I have never seen that, and it is going to be on now his defense attorneys to go and speak to him and tell him this verdict that literally is going to change the course of his life.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't see myself in that situation, but I think if I were in that situation, I'd want to be there in that courtroom to hear it for myself. I don't want my attorney to come back several minutes later, because you can see there's still things going on in that courtroom before his attorneys can even get back there to tell him that. It's not like he has a cell phone. He's not on Twitter. He's not getting this information. So I don't think I could sit there and wait that long to get this decision myself.
Yes, he's just likely in the back in a cell, and he is just waiting to hear his fate, and that has to be so nerve-wracking. I can't even imagine.
Yep, absolutely. I think we're going back to the courtroom right now. Sorry. So I believe we have actually a verdict in Keene as well. We've been covering that trial. Of course, Zachary Keene in the state of Iowa on trial for the murder of his 4-month-old son, Sterling. We should probably have that here shortly. We're going to go to a quick break here on the Law&Crime Network. Sorry, we're not going to a break just yet. Again, if you're just joining us, Tremaine Wilbourn was just sentenced to life without the possibility of parole in Tennessee. Again, he was charged, convicted of killing Officer Sean Bolton back in 2015 during a traffic stop. Tremaine Wilbourn exited the vehicle. There was a scuffle between the two. Sean Bolton was shot in the face, and when he fell to the ground, he was shot 8 more times. The jury has just unanimously sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole. I'm sure he will appeal that trial. We saw his behavior during this trial, so I'm sure his defense attorneys will try that appeal. They had already asked for a mistrial. The judge did not have that. We have so much more to come. Again, Keene, I believe a verdict is in that trial. We have so much more to come here on the Law&Crime Network. I'll be signing off. Liz Will be taking over. Stay tuned to the Law&Crime Network.